Singularity.
My name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity One-on-One. Singularity One-on-One is a regular podcast feature of Singularity weblog, where you can go and listen to it or download it in full. If you guys enjoy the show, you can help me make it better in one of several ways. You can go and write a brief review on iTunes, you can leave a comment on the blog, or you can simply make a donation. As always, I will be the man with the questions, and today the guest with the answers will be David Pearce. David is a British utilitarian philosopher who promotes what he calls the Hedonistic Imperative. He is also the co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association and a vegan who argues that we, or our future posthuman descendants, have a responsibility not only to avoid cruelty to animals within human society, but also to alleviate the suffering of animals in the wild. So, hi David, I'm very happy to have you on my show.
Hi Nicola, it's good to hear from you. Hello everyone.
Fantastic. So, David, if you were to introduce yourself in your own words, how would you do it?
Good heavens. Well, I don't really do a great deal other than talk and write. In one sense, I'm already exceeding my design limitations. But yes, essentially what I write about is the use of biotechnology to phase out suffering, not just in humans, but in non-human animals too. The goal of phasing out suffering, of course, is not itself new. One can trace it back to Buddhism, for instance. But what's different now in the 21st century is that it's possible to at least outline how it's technically feasible. Yes, one has to be very careful. Simply because something is technically feasible, this doesn't mean it's actually going to happen. But there are tentative grounds for outlining how it really will come to pass.
So let me, before we get to the specifics of how you propose that we alleviate suffering, let me ask you about philosophy. How and where does it fit in your life? And what was the story, perhaps, that you fell in love with philosophy? How did you come to become a philosopher?
I think more than anything else, philosophy is a matter of temperament. One can have someone who is extraordinarily bright and intelligent, but simply has no appetite for questions that sound philosophical. Equally, there are people who just by nature have the philosopher's temperament. They tend to be depressive, brooding, introspective. This is a rather sweeping statement. I should add that although, yes, I suppose I might call myself a philosopher, I think that philosophy that is untutored by science and the sciences is likely to be bad philosophy. Having said that, I think science that does not at least take some interest in philosophy is not thereby going to transcend philosophy, but simply give bad philosophical assumptions a free pass.
Yeah. But how did you get to be exposed to philosophy? Was it in school? Did you read a philosopher at some point in your life? Or what was your sort of entry point?
Well, it would be nice to report at the age of 13 or something like that, I stumbled across Kant's critique of pure reason or something and never looked back. No, I think I was probably about 12 or 13 and I picked up on a news station bookstall a little book called Philosophy Made Simple. Embarrassing to say, that was the first book of philosophy I ever read.
But I think from humble beginnings we get to great ends. So the beginning is not important, the journey is, and how far we're willing to take it, right?
Yes, I'm inclined to think so. Perhaps just I would add too that although I happen to be utilitarian, it's possible to favor phasing out the biology of suffering regardless of whether you're any kind of utilitarian. You could be a deontologist, a pluralist, a Christian. All it takes, I think, is this very minimal ethical commitment to phase out involuntary suffering. So no one need feel they need to sign up to utilitarian ethics to support the abolitionist project.
But why did you pick utilitarianism as your favorite flavor of philosophy? What was it that attracted you? What was it for you that grabbed you, inspired you, perhaps?
I think it's the combination of compassion and rationality, what would now be called rational altruism. Clearly, my own suffering and the suffering of those I loved and care about loomed large in my life, but I also took very seriously from science the so-called view from nowhere, the idea that it is completely an illusion that one is the center of the universe, and if my suffering is bad for me, I infer that suffering anywhere for anyone is bad. Utilitarianism in that sense is systematized compassion.
Mm-hmm. And where does veganism fit into the picture, and how?
It's back to the rationality again. It's very natural to contrast humans and non-human animals in the way it was once very natural to contrast white Christian gentlemen with primitive savages. That all the convergence of evidence from neuroscience, evolutionary biology, neurophysiology, suggests that non-human animals, the ones, pigs and so on, are as sentient and as sapient as pre-linguistic toddlers. And we treat non-human animals in the way that if a human were to treat a pre-linguistic toddler in the way we treat pigs, for instance, that the perpetrator would be locked up for life. Mm-hmm. And it is, in that sense, I won't argue here for anyone who says, let's say, a moral anti-realist who says there's nothing wrong with abusing or killing toddlers. But assuming we take that as read, that it is profoundly abhorrent to harm human toddlers, I would say it is profoundly abhorrent to harm non-human animals. Instead of harming them and exploiting them, we should be thinking of ways to help and look after them.
So at what point in your life did you start thinking about becoming a vegan, and why? Was there a particular event that triggered that line of thinking?
Well, actually, I'm a third-generation vegetarian. Grandparents on both sides were vegetarian, which is probably unique to the West. But this is an accident of birth rather than the signature of great virtue on my part. But yes, clearly that background, my parents were Christians, I should add, must have contributed to my early development. One of my earliest memories was trying to rescue little ants that cruel small boys had trodden on. That must have been about the age of 4 or 5. So yes, I said it's very difficult clearly to understand fully one's own intellectual antecedents, but that clearly was a contributing factor.
Mm-hmm. So you've been a vegan since birth?
Oh no, I was a vegetarian since birth. Vegan much more recently, about 7 or 8 years ago.
So you've never had meat in your life?
No, I would not recognize the taste of meat, no.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. So now you were talking about the fact that pre-linguistic toddlers probably exhibit the same level of sentience such as, say, adult pigs, which we slaughter for food on our industrial scale. Can you define your threshold for sentience, and how do you measure it?
It is clearly harder to give an accurate quantitative measure of, for instance, suffering in pre-linguistic humans and non-human animals. But what one can do is operationalize the notion and investigate how hard either a human or a non-human animal will work to obtain or avoid a particular stimulus. So in that sense, it's possible to quantify pleasure and pain. Also, one can investigate this down to the molecular level. There are, to take one example, there is a particular gene, the SCN9A gene. Nonsense mutations induce complete insensitivity to pain. Other mutations induce either very high or a very low pain threshold. And so, yes, one can investigate, and if one looks at pigs and toddlers, one finds that the molecular pathways and the genes and the gene expression profiles implicated in pain, pleasure, and our raw emotions are almost identical. What distinguishes humans from non-human animals is, in many cases, extraordinarily subtle at the genetic and molecular level.
Mm-hmm. But how do we know that huge genetic overlap would be sufficient to translate into sentience proper?
One can't defeat radical skepticism. I mean, the only person one will ever know for sure is conscious is oneself. But it seems a reasonable inference to the best explanation to assume this. After all, science is based on the principle of the uniformity of nature. Mm-hmm. I infer that you feel profound distress because if you catch your hand in the door, your behavior is similar to that of me or a pig. The molecular processes at work in your mind brain seem to be nearly identical. What distinguishes you or me from the pig, or for that matter, the pre-linguistic toddler, number of things, but in particular, it's our capacity for generative syntax. And there's very little evidence that this capacity for generative syntax is bound up with degree of sentience. After all, if you ask me how was it that I produced the sentence I'm doing now, which no one has ever uttered in the history of the world before, it's opaque to introspection. It's very, very subtle and elusive, the phenomenology of thought. I think most of us have this idea of the great chain of being, with humans more intensely conscious than any other creature. But if you actually look at consciousness, it's the most primitive forms, pain, fear, disgust, and so on, that are the most intense, whereas the most cerebral, ability to solve differential equations or generate complex sentences are actually the thinnest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of my audience member asks this: is there such a thing as vegan since we are ingesting so much bacteria every minute?
I think the critical distinction is that bacteria are, to the best of our knowledge, not subjects of experience. And I think so in that sense, I don't think one needs to worry about the ethical status of bacteria, of lettuces, and much more controversially, I don't think a digital computer is a subject of experience either. But yes, it's not a matter of personal purity. It's a matter of not causing harm to fellow subjects of experience.
We're going to come back to the question of computers, but let me move up the ladder here and ask you: how about fish?
If you look at, for example, the molecular substrates of panic and terror and pain in a fish, they are extraordinarily similar to that of a human being. Now, it seems unlikely that fish, for instance, have some metacognitive capacity for reflective self-awareness. But on the other hand, if you're in a state of blind terror or panic or agony, neither do you.
Mm-hmm. And what about in vitro meat? Would you? I mean, it probably shouldn't even be called meat because it's in vitro. Mm-hmm. Would you consider that a potential for your vegetarian diet?
Though personally I have no craving for meat, I'm extremely enthusiastic about the potentiality of in vitro meat because, unfortunately, there is no argument against moral apathy. One can argue to one's blue in the face, but at the end of the day, many people will just shrug their shoulders and say, "But I like the taste of meat." Now, one wouldn't consider this a satisfactory rationalization of child abuse. Whether it should be considered a satisfactory rationalization of animal abuse is another question. But if we are really to have global veganism or in vitrotarianism, I think it is essential to further develop and commercialize in vitro meat. And one definition of transhumanism, if you like, is technical solution to ethical problems. Now, I suspect you might be skeptical that most people will be prepared to make the transition to something as unnatural as in vitro meat, but recall it's not, or it needn't be, genetically engineered. And in many ways, it's, inverted commas, more natural than today's factory farmed products from live animals. So yes, I think there is going to be an in vitro meat revolution, and once, for the most part, we have made the transition, I think our grandchildren are going to be appalled and incredulous that we could have treated sentient beings in the way we did.
Mm-hmm. But would you consider consuming it yourself?
I would have absolutely no ethical problems. Whether at a purely culinary level I would like it, I don't know. I would have no ethical qualms about
so
trying
you're open to trying it, yeah.
But the most common inquiry at New Harvest, which pioneered research into in vitro meat, believe it or not, is people inquiring whether it will be possible to prepare human flesh in this way. So though cannibalism wouldn't personally be to my taste, I don't have any qualms other than aesthetic qualms for people who want to try it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. David, you are the co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association. So let me ask you, you just said that I was going to ask you to define transhumanism for us. So do you want to stick with transhumanism is a technical solution for ethical problems? Is that the best definition?
I suppose a standard one-sentence definition would involve the use of technology to overcome our biological limitations. And I think it's very useful just as a mnemonic to have, if you like, the three S's. Transhumanists believe in super intelligence, super longevity, and my particular focus, super happiness, super well-being. Once again, any little slogan like that is going to be a gross simplification. But yes, it's perhaps a useful mnemonic.
Mm-hmm. It kind of sounds to me almost like supermanism, super everything.
A lot of supers, yes.
Super longevity, super, intelligence, etc. Now, is it fair to say that mainstream philosophy has largely ignored transhumanism for the past 30 years or so?
Yes, I think that is quite a fair description. I won't attempt to give a lightning synopsis of the history of analytic philosophy for the past 30 odd years or so. Well, I can if you want. But yes, transhumanist themes have not been central to mainstream philosophy.
Why do you think that's the case?
Part of the reason, I think, is that in the second half of the 20th century, mainstream academic analytic philosophy became quite estranged from developments in science, partly under the influence of the later Wittgenstein and the Oxford School of Philosophy. And this is slowly changing, but only slowly changing. Nick Bostrom, whom I co-founded the World Transhumanist Association with, as you know, is now a professor in Oxford, which 20 years ago would be absolutely unthinkable. The home of ordinary language philosophy now has a future of humanity institute.
Yes. So do you think we're making ground here?
Yes, I think so, but inevitably progress is slow.
What do you say to people who say that transhumanism is kind of very British and libertarian in character. I mean, Nick Bostrom, yourself, Max Moore, for example, some of the most notable figures in transhumanism nowadays are all British and allegedly libertarian.
Max Moore would certainly fall under the category of the libertarian wing. I'm very much on the dripping left liberal wing, shall we say, of transhumanism. Yes, I think if I, let's say, was born in the Soviet Union, old Soviet Union, for instance, I might have a very different perspective, but my gut instincts are those of the left. As I said, gut instincts, it's not generally very fruitful to draw this simple left-right line, but transhumanism spans the traditional left-right divide.
But so if we can call it at all, the British school is kind of predominant, if you will. Is that?
I would, if you look at the state of contemporary transhumanism, singularitarianism, for instance, whether the Kurzweilian variety or the Miri variety, is not distinctively British. Aubrey de Grey, who has done more than anyone else to rescue super longevity from Crank Alley to serious science, yes, he is British, and yes, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm a Brit myself. But I wouldn't describe transhumanism as a distinctly British phenomenon. It certainly has a strong Anglo-American influence, but.
Now, some of the most best-known transhumanists that I know in person here in North America are all following the paleo diet. How do you feel about that as a vegan? Max Moore, for example, Natasha Whittemore, I know James Hughes and George Dvorsky. Generally, the North American school transhumanists that I know of, they're pretty much almost without exception that I can think of followers of the paleo diet.
Well, back to the Paleolithic is not a distinctively transhumanist slogan. I think, once again, the fact that vegetarians statistically tend to record higher IQ scores, they tend to be slimmer, they tend to be longer lived. I'm very skeptical that this shows that vegetarianism is the healthier diet, though it may be, but it does illustrate that if there are really benefits to a meat-based paleo diet, they must be extraordinarily marginal.
Let me push you on that claim a little bit, though, because I was reading a number of studies that were comparing huge slices of the Indian population, where you have something like 300 or almost 400 vegetarians, and those people were not exhibiting any less diabetes, any less heart disease than their contemporary meat-eating Western counterparts. And furthermore, development with respect to IQ, of course, is very much related to the brain development. And there's a lot of studies that show that children who do not receive sufficient amount of zinc, iron, magnesium, and a bunch of other elements in their diet, which are readily found in meat, tend to have generally stinted brain development, which can never be overcome after a certain point. In other words, if you have a child born in Africa, in a culture or in a situation of near famine, where they only have access to grains, for example, there's a large proportion of the population which would suffer stinted brain development, given the lack of vitamins, proper minerals, etc.
Yes, I mean a grain-based diet, for instance, would put one at risk of tryptophan deficiency, for example. Other things being equal, it is safer from a purely self-interested point of view to be a lazy meat eater to a lazy vegan. All I'm trying to do is suggest that any differences at all must be extraordinarily subtle for this to be the case. Now, it's rather different in, let's say, Africa, when certainly the capacity, when the opportunity arose in our ancestral past to eat meat, human or non-human, was fitness enhancing. But the question is today, when it's essentially a lifestyle choice, whether one chooses to harm other sentient beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to tell you the truth, for me, personally speaking, I accept sort of the ethical impetus behind being a vegan. But with respect to health, I am very much not convinced that that's a healthy choice. And yes, perhaps if you are what you call a non-lazy vegan, in other words, you have to be meticulous about supplementing with all the supplements like iron, zinc, etc. But if you do that, that in itself shows that vegan diet is not diet which is evolutionarily adapted to our own bodies. So it puts your health at risk.
I don't think there's any evidence that being a careful vegan puts one's health at risk. Being a lazy vegan most certainly does. Very different simply being a vegetarian. An egg, for instance, nutritionists regard that as the ideal food, the only thing nutritionally ideal, the only thing egg lacks is vitamin C. So yes, I would advise anyone contemplating becoming a strict vegan to mug up on nutrition first. You need to make sure you're getting a good source of vitamin B12. Vegetarianism, though, any claim of nutritional deficits is completely overblown.
Mm-hmm. David, we spend a lot of time on diets, and of course the reason for that was not nutritional but ethical, because I wanted to sort of give us a better perspective of where you're coming from and what's your sort of ethical outlook on the world, which I believe has a lot to do, of course, with the work that you do, starting with the abolitionist project, which aims to create a world without suffering. So would you mind telling us about that, please?
Yes. Essentially, thanks to biotechnology, and let's just start with humans, it should be possible to phase out both psychological and physical pain, not just overnight, but over the long term. And one of the clearest ways that we can start consists of the coming reproductive revolution of what is sometimes known as designer babies. Even now, if you wanted to do so before having children, you could use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to ensure that your future child has a high pain threshold and also a very high hedonic set point. By high hedonic set point, I mean, if you think of the analogy of a thermostat, some people are temperamentally gloomy and depressive. Their mood may fluctuate a little, but they have a very dark conception of life. Other people, their hedonic set point is much, much higher. And one of the things that choosing a high hedonic set point for your future child does, it loads the dice in your child's favor. If you have a high hedonic set point, it's still possible to retain critical insight. You're still going to have information sensitive gradients of well-being, but nonetheless, your quality of life is likely to be much higher. For example, here's just one example. The COMT gene has two alleles. one of which is associated with a high hedonic set point, the other with a low hedonic set point. Which, if you had the choice, would you choose for your future child, or would you prefer the traditional genetic crapshoot? Now, this isn't even genetic engineering. This is just pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. But as a result of decoding the human genome over the next few decades, it's possible. It's going to be possible to actually have designer genomes, and instead of mere genetic tweaking, it's going to be possible to re-edit the human genome, choosing personality variables, hedonic set point. And clearly it is speculative, the nature of selection pressure in a world where instead of having blind natural selection based on random mutations and not foresight, instead an era of selection pressure in which prospective parents are choosing the genetic makeup of their prospective children in anticipation of the likely characteristics. But not merely do I think it is ethically desirable that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis becomes the norm. I think that there is some evidence that at least that it is actually likely to happen. Once again, this is speculative. Simply because one can say something is technologically feasible, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. But just as something like cystic fibrosis, for instance, if you do, if pre-implantation genetic diagnosis does become the norm, no one is going to choose a cystic fibrosis allele for their future child. Its future is bleak. The cystic fibrosis alleles. But I would argue the same is true of genes predisposing to low mood, depression, anxiety disorders, some of our nastier characteristics that were fitness enhancing in the ancestral environment, but won't be in the new selective regime.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask you a little bit about suffering here. You've mentioned in the beginning, in passing, about your own suffering. Would you mind telling us a little more about that by any chance?
I think Andrei Gromyko once said, "My personality does not interest me." That would be an overstatement in my case. And I've certainly witnessed a fair bit of suffering in my time. And as I said, the only thing that is really different is the technology that now makes it optional, I would say.
But wouldn't you say that suffering has led you to become who you are today in a way, and get into the whole issue of alleviating suffering? Right? Maybe if you didn't suffer, you wouldn't have been trying to create any of your work which aims at alleviating or abolishing suffering entirely.
Yeah, well, that is one way I can, I suppose, rationalize suffering. But one thing perhaps it's worth stressing is that one knows from silicon robots, for instance, they can have the functional analogues of agony or anxiety and all the rest of it. And why can't organic robots do the same? So when one talks about abolishing suffering, whether physical or mental, it should be possible to retain the functional analogues of our existing unpleasant states without the nasty raw feels. I'm not convinced we want to retain even the functional analogues of something like jealousy, but in the case of something like physical pain or anxiety for the foreseeable future, it's clearly highly desirable that we retain this functionality.
And is it technically possible? Because the general sort of historical perspective on this, stemming both from Western philosophy and from, say, Buddhism, is that it comes as part and parcel of the whole package. It's basically, I think it was Socrates who said something like, no pleasure, no pain. Mm-hmm. So if you know pleasure, you would therefore also know pain. And you cannot know one without the other. It's like the Buddhists would say, it's like left and right, up and down, something or nothing. You have to have one to have the other. You cannot have up without having down. How can you have pleasure without ever having pain?
It's a very powerful intuition, this contrast effect. However, one only needs to consider today how tragically there are some people who endure chronic depression or chronic pain. And it would be extraordinarily cruel to tell them, you can't really be suffering because you've no way of contrasting it with bliss. I mean, recall there are some severe depressives who not merely are they never happy, they don't even know what the word happiness means. I mean, it's that severe. And now for evolutionary reasons, it's extremely unusual to get people at the opposite extreme. But someone like Anders Sandberg, for instance, and I use him as a case study by express permission, as he says himself, I have a ridiculously high hedonic set point. It's not as though he enjoys completely uniform bliss, but essentially, yes, his life is animated by intelligent, information-sensitive gradients of well-being. And in principle, it's possible to ratchet everyone up to Anders' level of well-being and beyond Anders to super well-being and super bliss. Once again, as long as one has this, as I said, informational sensitivity to good and bad stimuli, one can retain critical insight, the capacity for development, empathetic understanding. The enemy of intelligence and development, it's uniformity, whether uniform bliss or uniform misery.
But the key here that I'm trying to drive is that you still must be able to retain the apparatus to be able to experience the full spectrum. In other words, yes, say Anders is... you can perhaps ratchet Anders' hedonic point even higher, but in principle, he must remain capable of going in the opposite direction too. Because isn't it the same apparatus that allows for this to be experienced?
Well, you can, for instance, have a complete nonsense mutation of the SCN9A gene, and this completely abolishes the capacity to feel any form of pain, and this congenital analgesia, and this poses all sorts of health problems.
Absolutely.
But once again, here technology comes to the rescue, that if we want to in future, we can offload the nasty side of life onto smart prostheses. When a silicon robot sensors detect sulfuric acid being sprinkled over its extremities, there is not the kind of the nasty raw feels of agony, but there is the functionality of withdrawing the limb. And likewise, in the long run, if we want to, we can offload such functionality such that if your hand is just about to hit the hot stove, there is a very rapid withdrawal, presumably with a manual override, so you don't feel you've lost control of your body. In the meantime, though, before we get to this level of transhumanist sophistication, the obvious partial solution is just to give ourselves very high pain thresholds. As we know today, there are some people, they don't have congenital analgesia, but their pain thresholds are far, far higher than the rest of us, and they can function pretty normally.
Can they experience pleasure completely? In other words, is there any impact on their pleasure sensitivity with the diminished pain sensitivity?
Here we I said this in terms of bodily well-being. I don't know how comprehensively this has been researched, but yeah, clearly what one wants to do is to phase out the nasty experiences, whereas retain and amplify the good experiences. Now, perhaps a counter argument here is that surely these raw feels must play some functionally indispensable role. But if this were really the case, it would be an extraordinarily profound result. I mean, the consensus, as you know, in computer science and information technology is that it's going to be possible to replicate the functionality of the human organism in silico. So if it really were the case that the raw textures of unpleasantness were functionally indispensable, it would be an extraordinarily profound result.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to figure out. But of course, my perhaps wrong intuition is that it comes, or maybe that's just years of sort of brainwash training, is that it comes as a part of the package. Mm-hmm. And people would say, well, we would be desensitized like a robot, basically, if you can't feel pain. Therefore, intuitively speaking, most of us would assume we would be incapable of feeling pleasure. We would be simply desensitized like robots.
Well, I mean, already today, for instance, one can take empathetic euphoriants, for instance, like MDMA ecstasy, which I said, given it's potentially neurotoxic, I don't recommend this particular agent. But no, one shouldn't imagine that phasing out the biology of suffering is a recipe for us becoming zombies. On the contrary, I think it should be possible to radically intensify the nature of experience. Indeed, I think it highly likely posthumans, their intensity of awareness will compare to ours as, let's say, a glowworm to a supernova. So no, I don't think one should imagine this as somehow the zombification of humans. But when it comes to the nasty side of life, nasty stimuli, yes, I think temporarily for the short-term future, we want to get them as minimal as possible and eventually phase them out. One doesn't want to heighten and enrich our capacity to suffer.
What about the impact this would have on the progress of our civilization? I mean, it's been said that all great accomplishments come after great suffering. And I mean, we started with the fact that you suffered, and therefore perhaps that was part, or the biggest part of the motivation for you trying to alleviate further suffering on a global scale. So isn't it true to say, or what do you think of the saying that all great suffering, all great accomplishments come after great suffering?
Well, I mean, would Deep Blue play better chess if it experienced fear when one put its king in check? In the case of silicon systems, one knows that this manifestly isn't the case. As I said, in the case of organic robots, what is critical in terms of securing intellectual development and progress is to retain this informational sensitivity. Yeah, sure. If we were talking about kind of uniformly blissed out rather than blissful, this certainly would be a threat to the development of the species and possibly the future of intelligent life in the universe. But I would stress this is not what we're talking about here. At least it's not sociologically realistic to imagine that the future of life is us all kind of wireheading or being on opioid drugs. Because yes, that would be one route to phasing out suffering altogether, but it's not realistic. There would be extremely strong selection pressure against wireheads or heroin addicts or something like this. By contrast, by aiming to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, intellectual progress can continue.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about the hedonistic imperative. How is it similar or different from the abolitionist project?
I confess I rather sacrificed my ethical seriousness for the sake of a snappy title. Hedonistic Imperative is obviously...
Yeah, I'm going to try and get you on that a little later, but let's get there first.
But yes, of course, this is a very big if, but if and when we do reach the stage where we have phased out suffering, experience below hedonic zero, in both humans and non-human animals alike, and that later perhaps we can sketch out how it's possible in non-humans too, there is the question, should we be satisfied with simply modest levels of well-being, with information-sensitive gradients of well-being that never falls below hedonic zero, but nonetheless is still within the normal bounds of experience today? Or should we aim for radical super happiness? And if one looks at the kind of molecular processes involved, there doesn't seem any reason why we can't radically amplify our hedonic capacity. I don't think this is morally urgent in the same way as phasing out suffering is morally urgent. But a few centuries hence, I said this is going to be a very big speculative if, okay, we have phased out all involuntary suffering, what then? Are we really going to be satisfied with fluctuating around this sort of modestly, this somewhat higher hedonic set point, or should one aim for, gradients of sublime well-being? And regardless of your ethical persuasion, I think the default option should be, let's take this further.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that the abolitionist project's completion is in a way a prerequisite for the hedonistic imperative?
Yes, I mean, it's clearly, I said, I think we have a responsibility to all other sentient beings. So it's not a case right now as one wants to become as blissful as possible without regard to the well-being or ill-being of others. I think one should be treating this on a global level.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the title now, you said you had to sacrifice in order to get sort of a catchy title. Now, hedonism has a sort of a bad vibe to it, doesn't it?
Yes,
it's more like the empty pursuit of pleasure without any limit.
It can conjure up something rather amoral and shallow and one-dimensional hedonism. And you even have this expression, empty hedonism, too. In practice, if one enjoys states of sublime well-being, they tend to be apprehended as hyper meaningful. It's depression that tends to seem empty and in severe cases almost nihilistic. But yes, the term hedonism, though some people may find it attractive, I think for a wider range of people, they certainly would feel ambivalent about it. And yes, when I speak of the hedonistic imperative, it's not a case of party hedonism. Not that I've anything against parties, but
for me, the good sort of flavor of hedonism is Epicureanism, because that's where I draw the difference. Is that hedonism is kind of more meaningless and empty, whereas Epicureanism is still pursuing pleasure, but in a much smarter way, in a much more sort of net positive way, if you will. And speaking of Epicureanism, by the way, Epicurus was one of those people who allegedly was totally capable of being happy while suffering. And there are reports of his death. I can't remember what kind of cancer he was dying from or what kind of condition. I think it had something to do with kidney cancer or kidney failure or something very painful. And he was supposedly dying in his bathtub or something like that, and asked his students for a glass of wine and maybe some cheese or bread. But supposedly he was very happy and jovial until the very moment that he died, even during that very painful process. What do you think of reports like that? Do you think it's possible for one to be happy while suffering?
Has to be careful how one defines it. Someone with an extraordinarily high hedonic set point, for instance, can maintain cheerfulness in adversity that would cripple the rest of us. But however much philosophical wisdom one has, there are a very large number of people who simply could not endure a toothache with equanimity. Yes, this may well be true of Epicurus, but unfortunately, all too many people, their lives are blighted by suffering of all kinds, and it's not life enriching. It doesn't make them better people. It's not ennobling or anything like that. It's just meaningless for the most part, at any rate.
So, do you support the using of? That's another audience question. Do you support using sex hormones, thyroid hormones, aromatase inhibitors, etc., in combo with psychotronics to improve well-being?
Yes, it needs to be done with considerable caution. For instance, testosterone is, amongst other things, it's also quite a powerful antidepressant and painkiller. But as we know, there's a great spectrum of physiological and psychological effects that come from enhancing one's native testosterone function. Yes, in principle, I support, but, and this is going to sound lame, one wants to read up as much as possible on the literature of possible adverse side effects.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever struggled with depression yourself, David? In the beginning, you said that people who are philosophers tend to be a little bit more introspective, more depressive. So I wonder if you have any, putting aside the introspection.
My natural default state, sort of normal hedonic tone, would probably be a kind of chronic low-grade depression, not the severe depression of some people who just don't feel like eating or anything like that. But yeah, if I didn't take a cocktail of moodiness, my life would be, I would just be one of the innumerable walking wounded of life.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of psychotropics do you use? And why? I mean, that's another audience question. What benefits have you noticed, and which ones would you advocate others to look into?
I think one needs to be, and apologies, there's a landline ringing in the background. I hope you can't hear it. I hope it'll go away. I personally take selegiline and amyneptine. Selegiline is also known as L-deprenyl. It's a selective monoaminoxidase type inhibitor. It amplifies dopamine function in multiple animal models. It tends to increase life expectancy, so it seems unlikely it's going to be doing one any particular long-term damage, though one doesn't know with human models. The other agent I take, amyneptine, it's a dopamine reuptake inhibitor with weak noradrenaline reuptake inhibiting properties. I would only suggest anyone contemplate taking either of these agents if they're at all prone to melancholic or retarded depression, and not if they are prone to anxiety or agitated depression. Biochemical individuality is such that there isn't such a thing as the ideal regimen for everyone.
There's a lot of taboo in public opinion about the responsible use of psychotropics to improve personal well-being. What do you think can be done or should be done about that?
I think probably we want to highlight the inconsistencies of the people who argue against the use of these agents, and ultimately, depending on one's metaphysical framework, admittedly, that you and I are a bunch of chemicals, and therefore tweaking these chemicals, our molecular architecture, it doesn't involve some radically new principle. Now, clearly, if you think that we're somehow made in God's image, or for that matter, you believe in the wisdom of Mother Nature and that humans are pretty much perfect as they are, then the idea with tampering with God's handiwork or interfering with Mother Nature is going to be an anathema. But I'm assuming that most of your audience are going to be natural, a more naturalistic picture. And if one does, just as silicon robots, they can be upgraded, both their hardware, their firmware, and their software. Likewise, organic robots too can be upgraded. At the back of a lot of people's mind, I think, is this dichotomy between the natural and the unnatural. But we are so hypocritical. And, of course, some of the most kind of voluble critics of taking these agents of transhumanism and technological alternatives themselves, they'll have all the latest gadgets, and of course they're going to be wearing clothes, which is profoundly unnatural. So it's going to be a long-term process of persuasion, I think. Inevitably, younger people, I suspect, are going to be more receptive than the older generation, though that's a sweeping generalization. But no, I don't have any instant snap formula that will win everyone over.
Let me ask you this. What do you say to people who would say to you that you're just offering another, though hedonistic type of utopia among many?
I would first of all want to clarify that by recalibrating the hedonic treadmill, it doesn't involve your giving up any of your core values or your existing preference architecture, unless that is your values are directly tied into the infliction of suffering. All that, it's perhaps simplistic, but critically, what is involved in recalibrating the hedonic treadmill is simply that the quality of your life is vastly enriched. I mean, certainly I wouldn't presume to be telling anyone how they should be living their lives. It's not, Dave's 10-point plan to save the world and tell you how to live your life. It's more a case, particularly in the case of creating new life too, of loading the genetic dice in favor of our children to make it much more likely they'll have a high quality of life. So utopia, yes, you could say in one sense, but not a kind of a vision of a perfect society. It's not an environmentalist utopia. I'm not sort of trying to say people that they should be living their life X, Y, and Z. I think perhaps I should stress that it's a matter of choice too. I mean, someone who is happy with their life as it is, which may involve suffering. It's not a case of coercive of happiness. No one is going to be hauling you off to the pleasure chambers. Rather, it's a matter of ensuring that no one should be forced to suffer against their will. And this is what technology offers. Whereas now, unfortunately, most people, it's completely involuntary. Much of their life will be spent in states of malaise. In future, it's going to be optional. And so, yes, I'm certainly not selling a utopia that I would wish to coerce people into joining. It's a matter of opportunity and freedom, to use two much abused words.
Another one of my audience viewers, who I know for a fact is a vegan, CM Stewart, she's asking, when is killing a sentient being ever justifiable or acceptable now? And when is it ever justifiable or acceptable after the eradication of suffering that you propose?
Well, right now, if there is a clear and irreconcilable conflict between two sentient beings, such as, let's say, the Anopheles mosquito and humans, or for that matter, pigs, I would prioritize the interests of the more sentient being. Being an anti-speciesist, if you like, it's not a matter of saying that all sentient beings are equal. I certainly wouldn't wantonly tread on a fly or anything like that. But where there clearly is an irreconcilable conflict of interest, I think other things being equal, the interests of the more sentient being must come first. But I think, the critical criterion should not whether the being is of one's own race or one's own species. It should be sentience. So yes, life is messy. We all know this, and in certain cases, it's necessary to harm other humans. In certain cases, it's necessary to harm non-human animals. But the long-term goal, if you like, I think should be a kind of high-tech Jainism. Jainism is if you recall from India, Jains will sweep the ground in front of them rather than tread on a little insect. And I think most people in the West would regard this as faintly absurd. Just an interjection here, but compared to our posthuman successors, it may well be that humans are as insects compared to superhumans. So we better hope that they are Jains of a high-tech persuasion too.
But let me try and push you a little bit more here on the intraspecies conflicts. When it's unclear which one is the higher sentience being. Say, take two humans, for example, because it seems to me that you are kind of having a very sort of open utilitarianism where you do allow for, or do you, for murder or for killing of another human being. I shouldn't call it murder. I should say for killing of another human being under certain circumstances.
I think one needs to be careful with I think there are excellent indirect utilitarian grounds, for instance, for saying something like having an absolute prohibition against torture. This might seem to run against utilitarian ethics, the ticking bomb scenarios where one can imagine that torturing a terrorist or something could save dozens of lives. But a society in which torture is legal, it's likely to have spillover effects, will actually lead to worse consequences. So on indirect utilitarian grounds, I think, yes, we should respect, wherever possible, the sanctity of life. We should have enshrined in law a prohibition against torture, and in some ways implement the kinds of policies that are often associated with non-utilitarians. I think one needs to take quite a sophisticated utilitarian approach. So many of the criticisms one hears of a utilitarian ethic are actually revolve around the alleged bad consequences that would follow if utilitarian policies were pursued. But if a policy leads to these bad consequences in terms of suffering, then it clearly isn't a utilitarian policy initiative at all.
Mm-hmm. So, but just to be clear, you do accept that there may be some circumstances where killing other humans may be justified?
In practice, yes, very much. If you think of the progress, such as it is, of civilization, the state having a monopoly of violence rather than private individuals, I'm as near as one comes to a pacifist as is possible without being a pacifist. But yes, there are exceptional circumstances in which violence may be unavoidable. We all know that life is messy. But other things being equal, as I said, I think the sanctity of life is a very good utilitarian principle because it promotes respect for other sentient beings.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Now, let me ask you, that's in a way, that's kind of a very Buddhist way of thinking. So where does Buddhism fit into the picture? Or does it?
In one sense, clearly, you could say that I am arguing a very Buddhist perspective because one doesn't need to persuade a Buddhist that suffering and overcoming suffering is at the heart of our ethical permission. Perhaps where I differ from most Buddhists is that the traditional Buddhist route to overcoming suffering, the noble eightfold path. Unfortunately, for these meditational disciplines and the like, they're not going to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill. They're certainly not going to dismantle the food chain and the cruelties of nature. If we want to phase out the biology of suffering, the only route ultimately to pursue is the biotechnological route, which is not to say that there aren't all sorts of palliatives, and Buddhists have been pursuing them for thousands of years now. But if we're ethically serious about phasing out suffering, yes, we have to embrace the very latest technology. Perhaps I should say by very latest, it's not necessary to invoke anything like a Kurzweilian singularity or posthuman superintelligence. It will be possible to phase out suffering using recognizable extensions of existing technologies. But these are high-tech solutions. There's no getting away from this.
We've mentioned the Kurzweilian singularity several times by now, and I perhaps this is the moment that I would ask you, what's your take on the technological singularity?
I'm very skeptical that there's going to be anything like a hard singularity. Ray Kurzweil, is it 2045, the year humans are going to become immortal? That is marketing genius. Hats off to him. I can understand why he can get on the front cover of Time magazine. I don't think there is going to be a hard takeoff or anything like that. Are we heading for an era of post-human superintelligence? Yes, I think so, but I think it's going to be considerably later than 2045. And I am skeptical that organic robots are completely going to merge with our machines. For technical reasons, I think it highly likely we will retain our organic core for the foreseeable future. Whereas some of my transhumanist colleagues, for instance, believe in uploading, where essentially we're going to digitize and upload ourselves to our smart machines, and even more radical in one sense than Ray Kurzweil's vision is that of MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, who think it highly likely that a singleton AGI will essentially replace humans, and not in a friendly way too. My own take on this is that organic robots are going to be recursively self-editing our own genetic source code and are going to be bootstrapping our way to post-human superintelligence in combination with that of our smart machines. And as our AI gets smarter, it can help us to edit our genetic source code in ever more sophisticated ways. If I wanted to give a snappy slogan, one could speak of an organic singularity. But there's clearly a division within the transhumanist movement between those who imagine that our successors will also be our biological descendants, and those who think that humans will essentially be replaced.
Now, let me take some of the issues here step by step. And so, first of all, let's say that you're correct that perhaps Ray Kurzweil's timeline may be off by 2045. But does that really matter in philosophical terms? I mean, the way I look at it as a philosopher myself is this. The timeline is merely a detail. The more important is the general trend. So would it happen or wouldn't it happen? And if it would happen in 2045 or 2095 or 2145, it doesn't really make a difference in the grander scheme of things. And then the issue becomes not one of timeline or time frame, but more one of feasibility. So what do you think would be the impediments from this to happen?
First, I would say I agree with you that it's the principle that is most interesting, but from a marketing perspective, if one wants to get people interested in the idea and the technology, if you tell them it's going to happen 2090, they'll think, well, I'm going to be dead. Then to keep people's interest, one has to convince them somehow it's going to happen in their lifetime. I mean, what could be more cruel than to try to interest people in radical life extension than to tell them that we're going to find a cure for aging perhaps 10 years after you're dead? So from a marketing perspective, it's critical to pitch any kind of dates within the lifetime of a prospective of audience. But in terms of feasibility, well, I've got a confession here. I'm probably in a minority here. I do not think a classical digital computer is ever going to be sentient, a subject of experience. I think that classical digital computers will, yes, they will become faster and faster and ever more sophisticated and multifunctional, but I don't think awareness or consciousness is going to switch on. I don't think they're ever going to solve the phenomenal binding problem. Yes, in that sense, I think organic minds are different.
Mm-hmm. And why? Why would we never be able to bridge that difference?
I think it comes down to your analysis of how it's possible for organic minds to solve the binding problem. The binding problem, if anyone hasn't come across it before, is how is it possible that distributively processed edges, textures, motions, and so on in your mind brain are somehow combined into phenomenal objects. And those phenomenal objects, you apprehend them as part of a phenomenal field that in self contains multiple dynamic objects. And right now, in some sense, you are a unitary subject of experience. How that is possible for supposedly discrete classical nerve cells, not just to be 100 billion bits of atomic mind dust, but at least when one is awake or dreaming, sometimes, yes, this unitary subject of experience is completely unexplained. By analogy, I mean, think of the population of the United States, for instance. Here you have 320 million odd skull-bound minds. However they're interconnected, and let's assume that their connectivity can be sharpened and it can be made ever more sophisticated and functional, you're still going to have 320 skull-bound American minds. And okay, when you say, how do you know that it's not going to be possible at some time in future that the population of the United States becomes a single subject of experience? The answer is, I don't. But if that happens, it's inconsistent with reductive physicalism and the ontological unity of science. I mean, there is, in fact, a philosopher, Eric, and I'm going to mispronounce his name. He's got a Germanic-sounding name starting with an S, actually has a paper entitled "If Materialism is True, the United States is Probably Conscious." But anyway, the point of this analogy was it is as miraculous and unexplained, the fact that you and I are subjects of experience, as it is as if the United States were a subject of experience. And another way to highlight just how extraordinarily computationally powerful this capacity for phenomenal binding is to look at cases when phenomenal binding breaks down, where the cases of so-called motion blindness, where someone has a neurological accident and they can no longer detect motion. They will see a car in one place and then nearer them and then nearer again, but they don't apprehend motion. Or simultanagnosia, where they can literally only see one object at once. Or florid schizophrenia and the complete breakdown of unitary personality. As I said, extraordinarily computationally powerful. Organic robots, yes, apparently do this effortlessly most of the time. I have my own ideas how this may be possible. I should say in advance, I'm a quantum mind person. But yes, one shouldn't just take it as read that a classical serial digital computer at some stage in the future, that consciousness or phenomenal binding is just going to mysteriously switch on.
So what do you think of the Hameroff-Penrose model of quantum consciousness then?
I'm extremely skeptical for all sorts of reasons. Penrose, as I said, a brilliant mathematician. He has what the French call, and apologies for my terrible French pronunciation, deformation professionale. I mean, he's a mathematician, and he thinks that consciousness somehow gives us the capacity to compute non-computable functions, or rather mathematicians to compute non-computable functions, or something like that. Whereas in evolutionary terms, it's extremely difficult to make sense of anything like that. What possible selective advantage could this have conferred? I think one needs to look very much at the other end of the phylogenetic tree. I think the mind brain has been a quantum computer for the past 540 million odd years. And one, yes, needs to be looking at phenomenal binding and our capacity to run multimodal world simulations in almost real time, extraordinarily fast, computationally powerful. This is why even a bumblebee is far more sophisticated than DARPA's finest even now. So there are other problems too with the Hameroff-Penrose model. It depends on quantum coherence being sustained at what, on the face of it, is extraordinarily long timescales, and environment as warm and apparently noisy as the brain. It involves the notorious so-called collapse of the wave function, and I don't think there is any evidence that wave functions really collapse. This is it's a non-physical notion. So yes, I'm extremely skeptical of the Hameroff-Penrose model. But Hameroff-Penrose, this does not exhaust quantum mind hypotheses. It's worth Max Tegmark, why the mind brain is probably not a quantum computer. And Tegmark points out that any kind of plausible decoherence timescale is on the level of picoseconds, and he takes it as read that this is a kind of reductio ad absurdum of quantum mind models. But I don't regard this as a reductio ad absurdum. I would say let's assume that quantum mind critic Max Tegmark is correct. What would it be like to instantiate a quantum computer that was running at 10 to the power 13 quantum coherent frames a second, computationally optimized by millions of years of evolution? Well, you're probably a couple of objections to mind. An obvious objection would be, well, look, surely we perceive our local environment with a delay of scores of milliseconds, not picoseconds. It's absurd. But I think this objection would rely on a false theory of perception. It's not the case that one directly apprehends one's external environment. Rather that when one is awake, rather than dreaming, it is the environment that is selecting states of the mind brain. I mean, after all, one knows from one's dreams that one's mind brain is creating these world simulations. The difference is that when one is awake rather than dreaming, one's world simulation tends to causally co-vary with the local environment. So that's one a priori objection one can dismiss. Now, clearly, if this conjecture that quantum coherence it explains phenomenal binding, yes, there is a testable prediction here that when our experimental apparatus is of sufficient sensitivity to detect macroscopic quantum coherence in the brain, we will find not just the noise, phenomenologically and computationally irrelevant noise, as intuitively one might expect. I predict that one would actually find the formal structural analogues of the macroscopic objects of one's phenomenal world. I said that is a testable prediction, and yes, so many theories of mind and consciousness, there's a real shortage of testable predictions. I said I should flag if for any of your listeners. Now, clearly, I'm way out on a limb here, and of course, this conjecture may be falsified.
Mm-hmm. David, we are approaching the end of our interview, so let me ask you the last 3 or 4 questions here. What is your greatest fear?
My own personal greatest fear is that some form of multiverse is correct, whether Everett's conception or inflationary cosmology or something like that, in that I am cautiously optimistic that sometime within the next few hundred years, the world's last experience below hedonic zero in our forward light cone is going to occur. But within the context of a larger reality, I fear it may be the case that there are inconceivable many Everett branches where Darwinian life, pain and suffering goes on indefinitely. If something like the eternal inflation is true, very, very speculative, then it's not really the case that one is going to be phasing out suffering. Cosmology is in a state of flux, and I would very much like to think that reality is smaller than I fear. But in these debates, unfortunately, I am just an educated layman and spectator. We'll see how the theoretical cosmology pans out.
And what's your greatest dream or biggest inspiration?
Biggest inspiration? Well,
the biggest dream, perhaps.
Clearly, I would like to see heaven on earth for all creatures, great and small. It is, in that sense, not exceptionally different from a dream that people have had throughout history. It's just that, we now have tentative evidence that it's going to be technically feasible. And certainly once we have done literally everything we can to get rid of suffering from the world, and I say abolish it from our forward light cone, I hope we can forget about its very existence and then go on to the maximal degree of flourishing for all sentient beings.
That's what you refer to as paradise engineering.
Paradise engineering, yes.
Okay. What's the best place for people to find more about you and your work?
If you go to, let's say, abolitionist.com, you'll have quite a crisp synopsis of the abolitionist project. Many, many years ago, when the web was young and before we knew which way things were going to go, I set up headweb.com, web.com, headweb.com, which is, if you like, the motherlode site. I have a little family of sites. But yes, if you're interested in the particular strand of transhumanism that focuses on, the pleasure-pain axis and radical enhancements there, that's what I would focus on. For people who are more interested in super longevity or super intelligence, there are other sites, not my sites in particular, I could recommend. But yeah, if your focus is on suffering and what I've talked about, and it does strike some kind of chord, abolitionist.com.
David, we've been talking for well over an hour now. So what's the most important thing that you would like our viewers and listeners to take away from our conversation today? A single message, perhaps, that you want to send out there in the universe.
Good question. in terms of one's own life, as soon as one starts thinking about one's place in the place in the great scheme of things, yes, one can feel utterly insignificant, and probably most of us are. But at the very least, I think one wants to do no harm. And I would urge someone who does think that it's a good idea for us to phase out suffering by giving up eating meat, which, if one investigates the conditions of factory farming, the fact that pigs and other non-human animals are comparable to small children, yes, it is a crime against sentience on an almost unimaginable scale. And yes, that is what I would urge a meat eater do, and to try and persuade their friends to do likewise. You said one, I'm going to say two. The second thing I would urge, whether it's a case of if one is planning to have children, or if it's a case of grandchildren, advising your existing children, rather than playing the standard genetic roulette, to consider using pre-implantation genetic screening diagnosis. And although it still it exists only in quite crude forms, simply by choosing a handful of variant alleles, you can load the genetic dice in favor of your prospective children. And if enough people decide to do this, and this becomes the norm, there will be selection pressure against so many of the nasty traits that are endemic to Darwinian life.
David Pearce, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.